This episode of the Religious Studies Project is brought to you by the postgraduate programs in Religious Studies at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. They offer top Masters by Research, and lots of PhDs. So if you want to check out the link on the podcast page, David and I can vouch for the system at Edinburgh, and we think it's well worth checking out. Have a look. Welcome to another episode of the Religious Studies Project. My name's Chris Carter. I'm joined by
David Robertson.
And this week, we've got an interview that David recorded with Arkotong Longkumer and Bjørn Tafjord on what do we mean by Indigenous Religion? Question mark.
I think the easiest way to explain what that means is just to pass straight over to the interview. We talk about the World Religions Paradigm a lot here on the Religious Studies Project. And one of the things we've pointed out on several occasions is, you've got the big five, sometimes the big six, and it depends on who's editing the particular book, what those are. But you'll often get these additional categories stuck on, new religions, and increasingly indigenous religions. And that's what we're here to talk about today. It's not always very clear what it is we're talking about when we talk about indigenous religions. To discuss that today, we're joined by Bjørn Ola Tafjord of Tromsø University. Welcome back.
Thanks, David.
And we're also joined by Arkotong Longkumer of the University of Edinburgh. First time on the project itself, although a long-term friend of the project. So, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Let's start. Bjørn, you've talked about the idea of indigenous religions as a kind of language game. Maybe you could explain to us a little bit what you mean when you say that.
I think it's interesting to look at how people use the phrase indigenous religions in different ways. How academicians use it in different ways to do different jobs in their different academic projects. And I think it's also interesting to see how non-academicians use the phrase in different ways in order to do jobs in their different political, social, and cultural, whatever projects. And by paying attention to that, I think it becomes clear quite quickly that it's a phrase that is used in ways that varies a lot, and that this variation both creates troubles sometimes, both for academicians and for others in terms of understanding each other, but also that these are creative processes that also opens new possibilities both within research and explorations of different cases, but also in other projects as non-academicians tap into the discourses of academicians.
In some ways, this whole conversation really goes back to the earliest days of religious studies, doesn't it? And this kind of the idea of classifying religions full stop, with Thiele and Müller and people like that, because you can't have indigenous religion without this idea of religion itself, right?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the ways that religious studies scholars think about indigenous religions, often it's sort of the first way we think of it is as a class of religions, sort of all the other religions than those that fit in the World Religions Paradigm, and all the rest when we take out also the new religions or the popular religions or whatever we were to call that very varied group. So yes, I think that has been one typical way of thinking about it, but it has always, it seems, been one of these categories that sits uncomfortably in the scheme of the discipline.
Can I just add? I think it's interesting that what is interesting is that I think we're looking at indigenous peoples and how they actually practice religions. So I think if we are to approach indigenous religions as a category and try and find out across, say in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America, then I think we might have a problem because there is no set paradigm of what indigenous religion is. And I think it varies according to context. So I think what at least I'm interested in is how indigenous peoples kind of understand or practice this thing called religion. So I think in that sense, the category indigenous religions is not a primary factor. You see, I mean, it's something that comes out of us looking at indigenous peoples. So in that sense, I think it's slightly different from, say, the traditional scholar trying to find out what kind of religion is.
And that's an interesting point. Sometimes these kind of categories do come out of, a very good thing, and then, our attempt as scholars to more accurately represent what's going on. But at the same time, we need to kind of play the game of the field a little bit in order for our work to fit in and be understood anywhere. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that presents us with several problems, I think. If we are... I think if we have an assumption of what indigenous religion is in the academic kind of environment, and I think it's interesting also how that kind of understanding can play itself in the field. So, for example, much of my work is in kind of northeast of India, and I'm interested in how the kind of Hindutva or this kind of Hindu kind of nationalists co-opt this idea of indigenous religions to actually include this kind of fringe, kind of marginalized, non-Christian or non-Muslim groups into the fold of indigenous religions by also arguing that Hinduism is a kind of indigenous religion. So here I think we have a problem of how the academic term of indigenous religions is used quite effectively by the Hindu nationalists to propagate their idea of assimilation and inclusion.
Yeah, and Hinduism is a really interesting case because when you have more sort of formal academic attempts at presenting some sort of definition of what indigenous religion is, I mean, Jim Cox's definition is probably the most commonly encountered nowadays. You immediately run into problems when you start trying to apply it, because Hinduism is, by any of those categories, really, an indigenous religion.
I think often it can be worthwhile to pay attention to the two different words in the phrase. That in some projects, in the typical projects of religious studies, where you try to classify religions, then the emphasis will almost always be on the latter word, on religion, and then the adjective indigenous becomes some sort of classifier to say that this is a different religion from the other classes of religions. But in many uses, I think in many uses that are not part of religious studies, but also in some of the uses that are part of religious studies, the emphasis can also be on the adjective. And then it's not about classifying religions, at least not primarily. Then it becomes one about classifying peoples often, or other objects or things that are seen as belonging to particular kinds of peoples. It becomes shorthand for indigenous peoples. So it becomes the religions of indigenous peoples, which can be used both to sort of create groups and demand rights and have all these kinds of applications. But it can also be used to discriminate, of course. I mean, to talk about we and the other, and to exclude.
I think there's an implicit kind of distinction that goes on with that game, though, that sort of language game. I'll give you an example that I came across recently. In the undergrad course here in Edinburgh, they're given the task of visiting the museum and describing religious objects, and we got to talking about the way that religious, sort of indigenous religious things were presented, and the example was given of a boat with a painting of a sea deity on it, and this was interpreted as a religious act. And I said, are we maybe over-reading into that it's obviously religion because these are primitive people? I said, would we, if a truck drove past you on the A9 in Scotland and it had the St. Andrew's cross on the front of it, would we interpret that as a religious act by the truck driver to ensure a safe journey? It might be in some way, but it's also many other things. It's just a particular language that people do. And there are national uses to that symbol as well. But because it's in an exoticized indigenous culture, we kind of read religion in there in a different way. We assume this kind of primitiveness. Would that be fair to say?
I think part of the whole discourse of indigenous religions, I think there are a couple of challenges here. I think because people who study indigenous peoples and their cultures and religions, I think, are trying to say to the kind of academic world, you have to take us seriously. And I think because of that, sometimes we classify, I guess, ourselves as people who do indigenous religions in order to compete with the other kinds of kind of religions out there. And I think, but in terms of actual engagement, in terms of research with the people, I mean, we're not really trying to isolate categories out by saying that, this is a kind of religious act, or this is a political act, or this is an economic act. I think a lot of the people that we are working with tend to think about these categories in kind of overlapping terms. So I think part of the challenge is, and I think what we as scholars have to do is, I think we have to speak a certain kind of like language in order to communicate our ideas. And like it could be in the classroom, it could be in a conference, etc. But I think at the same time, we are also trying to destabilize these categories. And I think that's where the challenge is, because to a certain extent, we are in a Western academic environment. And of course, we're also in religious studies. So we have to try and articulate that. But at the same time, also, I think we have to be wary of the kind of limitations of these categories. So the kind of national, the political, the kind of religious, all of them intertwine.
I also think that those of us who study what we commonly call indigenous religions in religious studies, I think one way that we might have something to contribute with to the larger field is that most of us do fieldwork. Many who do other religions often go straight for the religion. If you do Islam, you go straight for the Islam. If you do Christianity, you go straight to study Christianity. Whereas when we do fieldwork, we are forced to sit around a lot and be in places. And one of the things we discover is that it's not all about religion all the time. Actually, religion happens. A religion is an act that is done just in different degrees, in different ways, but in different circumstances. But I think it makes us also aware of that religion is not around all the time, and that's one way that I think we can sort of be a group of scholars who remind the rest of the field about not exaggerating about the importance of religion. We tend to send our students out in the world to find religion, and of course they come back with religion. So the whole field exaggerates about the importance of religion.
And I think that also ties in with the point about how primitiveness is kind of often associated with how the people are so close to like nature and to gods and spirits and all of that, right? And I think to a large extent, that's not really the case, because a lot of the indigenous peoples that we are kind of like working with, have kind of like mobiles, where genes, and are kind of engaged in social media. And so, I mean, all of these practices are happening, and I think that sometimes destabilizes our kind of notion of what indigenous peoples are. That so this one thing that I'm kind of like working on is trying to kind of understand festivals, and there is a festival that I've been researching a lot, and it's called the Hornbill Festival, which happens annually in kind of like Nagaland, which is the Indian state. And what you often get is the tourists that come from the West, say primarily from, say, kind of Europe and North America, have a certain notion of what this festival is about. So it's about this indigenous subject, who is still dressed in their traditional clothes, are kind of like naked, or carry around spears. And they have this visual image because this image has been passed on from the colonial times. And they actually, when they come to the festival, they find out that, actually all of them are dressed like us, and they carry kind of mobile phones, etc. So that kind of image, I think, is quite prevalent. And I wonder if, to a certain extent, that also happens with our students, that they have a certain exotic image of what indigenous religions are. And if you don't give them that image, then probably they say, oh, well, it's not interesting, is it? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the challenge, I think, we as scholars, especially in indigenous religions, are trying to tackle, I think.
There's also this widespread assumptions that indigenous peoples have indigenous religions. And I think in what I study in Talamanca in Costa Rica, one of the first things I was told, and has been told repeatedly, is that before the arrival of the missionaries, before the Christians and the Baha'is came in the 1960s, we didn't have a religion. And still the word religion is usually reserved to point at those traditions that came in the 1960s, various versions of Christianity and the Baha'i faith. And it's only recently that some of the younger generation there has started to talk about what they used to call indigenous traditions. Now they started to talk about it as an indigenous religion. And those who do it most are those who have gone to university, who have probably learned from religious studies scholars or anthropologists or others that religion is something that exists everywhere in all societies at all times, and that indigenous peoples have a certain kind of religion, and then they return home, or they turn their gaze towards their own community and starts to translate indigenous traditions into indigenous religions, which I think is quite interesting.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's a very good example why conversations about how these categories operate is not just academic navel-gazing. These categories feed back into the world and have very real legal ramifications for people. They exist as legal entities. People begin to construct their own religious and ethnic identities around these categories that we've, given them, basically. I wondered if you wanted to reflect on that, because indigenous religion is not only an academic religious category or a practitioner category, but a legal, ethnic kind of category as well.
Yeah. And I think that is happening increasingly. I think that we have the case of the local indigenous religions, as it were. It could be in Africa, it could be in Asia, it could be Latin America. But we're increasingly seeing the globalization of indigenous religions as well, especially if we are fighting for kind of like national identity or sovereignty, or trying to safeguard your ethnic identity within kind of nation states. Mm-hmm. So the platform that really affords that kind of space is, of course, this kind of United Nations and the rights on indigenous peoples, which is kind of advanced a lot by the UN. So here you enter into, I guess, another arena of how these terms are actually quite positive and quite kind of useful and quite empowering as well. So, and I think couched in that is the very important idea of human rights, that having a kind of indigenous identity is intrinsically related to human rights issues. And of course, also protecting your own kind of religion, your own culture, your own traditions is also tied in with kind of human rights. So in a kind of broader global sense, the term indigenous or the term indigenous religions, I think, has a lot of purchase.
Yeah, and in order to gain something from it, you have to translate your traditions, your practices, your narratives into recognizable unit. In order to be recognized as an indigenous people or as an indigenous religion, you have to make it come across in a way that makes the judges in the courtroom, or whoever it is, the politicians who make the decisions, they have to recognize this as an indigenous religion or as indigenous people, and that sort of forces actors also to play into these expectations that are floating around.
Yeah, and I think to translate those kind of experiences, I think you tap into, again, the academic, the intellectual kind of discourses out there on what exactly is culture, what exactly is heritage, what kind of religion or politics, and all of that. So I think, yeah, I mean, the cycle of the kind of exchange of these ideas and categories, I think, are both, kind of like local and global, and they feed each other, I think.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
A couple of maybe slightly more critical take on that. I mean, one is that it's very interesting that in an increasingly globalized political system, that indigenous religion becomes one more aspect of an increasing sort of identity politics. So it's, seeking sort of national, religious, ethnic identities. It could also relate it to LGBT and all these kind of different interest groups rather than national representatives. But also there's the way that religion becomes one more card to play in power relations. So whilst sometimes, yes, absolutely, it does have to do with human rights, other times it's much more cynical. There is the case of the Canadian indigenous population who had no interest in promoting their practices as being an indigenous religion until an oil company wanted to drill there, at which point, by claiming indigenous status, they were able to prevent the drilling from taking place because the land was now seen as sacred by the UN, and protected by the UN. So, these... That's a very good example of the sort of post-colonial legacy of this category of indigenous religion goes over to these other people who then use it in the same power plays, which they've been gifted, if you like.
Yes, I also think that the recent history has to be taken into account, sort of the history of religions, not as a field of study, but as something in society that... back to the Costa Rican context, for example, the power and the position of the Catholic Church just a decade or two ago was so strong. They were able to dominate the discourse and to decide what was legitimate religion or not. I think the main reason why Bribris have said we have no religion is to keep it away from missionaries who would say, if you have an indigenous religion, then that's superstition or a false religion or idolatry. So maybe what has happened also in international politics in recent years is that some sorts of religions have lost their hegemonic position, whereas other kinds of religions have gotten more space. I certainly think that in the Costa Rican context, there has been a pluralization of the religious field. And as indigenous cultures and indigenous peoples have gotten more attention and they have been looked upon more positively from the outside, so has their religion. So I think this sort of return of indigenous religion to the public sphere, or the rise of indigenous religions in the public sphere, also has to do with the decline of the kind of discourse that before would classify this as superstition or idolatry or things that had to be fought, or primitive religions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or even primal. So, I mean, all of these academic terms, like primitive, primal, superstitious. Of course, I think people are also trying to reclaim a kind of identity. And I think the whole question of identity politics, I think it's interesting. And of course, identity politics kind of exists. And I think a lot of indigenous activists are also aware of that. And they take advantage of that because they're also making choices in the immediate present for their own communities against, say, kind of like exploitation or kind of oil drilling, which happens, or dam creations, which, so they're trying to protect their land, and they're also using these categories effectively. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. So it's not that, all indigenous peoples are so close to kind of like nature, and, they're all kind of aloof, and, they're all having a great time. But also, I think, on the other hand, I think the term, as Bjørn was kind of articulating, is that the term indigenous religions is also quite empowering. It's about reclaiming a kind of identity, and they are using the tools available, and there's kind of nothing wrong with that.
No, of course, that's, it's exactly the same as happens everywhere. And the point of bringing that up is to, an attempt to collapse that distinction, and we can see it being used cynically on both sides. That's that's human nature and the nature of religion. Just one further. Do you want to go before I change the subject slightly?
Yeah, it made me think also of there's again, returning to Talamanca and the Costa Rican context. I think indigenous religion, or religión indígena, as they would say in Spanish, is sometimes used as a foreign relations tool towards an audience of outsiders like us. I mean, academicians and politicians and others. But sometimes it also creates internal tensions. For example, when indigenous traditions are recast as indigenous religions, when indigenous religions are being taught at school, parents who are Christians, Pentecostals in particular, often say that my children should not take those classes, so they're pulled out of those classes. That they were fine with as long as these issues were not enacted or articulated as religion, but as culture. So bringing religion into the mix sort of changes a whole lot of situations and relations and the ways things are taught about.
But also just one final point. I think if we are looking at kind of indigenous peoples practicing a kind of religion, then are we also kind of open to what kind of religion kind of indigenous peoples are practicing? So, I mean, it could be, say, kind of Christianity. So in that sense, is Christianity an indigenous religion? And I think the common perception is that, you know, indigenous religions are largely non-Christian. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting thing, because, I mean, if we have a formal definition of what indigenous religions is, then I think it might problematize some of the ways we tend to think about indigenous religions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of relates actually to the question I was going to raise in a kind of unexpected way. And so I was going to ask about, there's a sort of time element in this. We don't, for instance, tend to see New Age practices in the West as an indigenous religion. Is that just because of the newness, or is it the colonial power aspect, or is it hangover to the hegemony of Christianity, for instance? But, you know, here in Scotland, just to take it as an example, because that's where we are, Christianity is only 58% or something at present. And that's just people who identify, not necessarily people who are practicing in any kind of meaningful sense. So, as you say, actually, once we start looking, the further down we go, these distinctions get more and more blurry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the term indigenous, I think, well, I mean, I'm not sure about the academic discipline of indigenous religions and how that came about. I think people like Jim Cox has kind of written about, this transition from primal to indigenous and all of that, and I think as far as I can recall, and you can correct me on this, I think it was from the 70s or the 80s that kind of indigenous religions actually came or was seen as a category in its own right. It's curious how the term indigenous is not really popular in, say, Europe. I think in Canada it is, and of course in kind of North America it is, and kind of Latin America it is, but in Europe it's quite interesting that it's not. I mean, we can perhaps easily say that actually kind of Christianity is an indigenous religion of Scotland. So yes, I mean, I'm interested in that kind of idea as well, and what makes something indigenous and what doesn't.
Well, one example I've mentioned before is, there's an example in Jim's book, and incidentally, for the history of that kind of emergence of and history of the term, Bjørn's previous interview with the RSP, we go into that in a bit more detail. But there's an example where he talks about Zulus in South Africa as being an indigenous tradition. But the Zulus migrated into South Africa from the Sahara in 700-800 years ago, whereas the Dutch arrived there about 400 years ago. So the choice of which of those is indigenous is entirely temporal.
Again, I think this has to do with that there are different language games being played here. I think the emergence of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement and its success since the 1970s and onwards has made the word indigenous take on primarily the meaning or the reference to indigenous peoples. So that's what most people associate with it today. That's perhaps the dominant use of it in most contexts. Whereas the older use of the adjective indigenous would be something like the opposite of exogenous. So it's a relational concept or relational category that could be applied to all kinds of things. But usually we associate today, I think, because of the success, the relative success of the international indigenous peoples movement, it has become this tag or emblem for indigeneity or for indigenous peoples, shorthand for indigenous peoples, really. Yeah. But it can be used in many other ways, and it is used in many other ways. But then the discussions tend to be, I think many misunderstandings arise from these.
Talking around each other then instead of to each other.
But I mean, it could be also a case of the dominant group not categorizing or kind of associating themselves with indigenous kind of religions, say. And, it could be that, the category indigenous religions is applied to only the kind of marginalized communities, which kind of incidentally, I mean, it's not always the case because I think kind of like speaking with Afe and all of that, in say kind of like Nigeria, I mean, indigenous religions is the dominant kind of group in certain areas. And of course, that again throws up, and of course, if we also kind of look at Hinduism as an indigenous religion, then what happens to the category, but also the way we conceive of indigenous religions, I guess, is the term that I'm kind of looking for. Yeah.
Thank you both. This has been a really interesting discussion, and we've covered most of the different ways this term's been defined and understood, but as you're hearing this term, as you're engaging with this term, just bear some of these ideas in mind and try and unpick which of the usages is being used in whatever source you're looking at any given time. So thanks again to both of you for taking part in the Religious Studies project today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, David.
Thanks so much for that, David. Wonderful to hear Bjørn back on the RSP, and great to hear Arko. He's been on staff here at Edinburgh for a few years now and has been sort of evading getting on the podcast, but well done for pinning him down, David.
Yes, and just in time because he's off back to India for a big research project, I believe, for the probably most of the next year. So it'll be a while before we get him back on, but get him back on we will.
We've got a couple of bits of news for you folks. One big bit of news since our last recording is that at long last, the Religious Studies project has gained charitable status in Scotland. So we're technically called the Religious Studies Project Association (SCIO), which stands for Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation.
Now, that doesn't mean that we're only a charity in Scotland. It just means we're incorporated in Scottish law, which is slightly different. And there were good practical reasons for doing that. It wasn't just, jingoism.
Exactly. And I'll be getting the website gradually updated, getting the constitution of the new SCIO up there and details of our trustees. But we have trustees based in Australia, the US, and the UK. So again, trying to keep that international feel. And also our donations, our Patreon campaign that you've heard about already today, it's been going pretty well. So do check out that. We now force you to listen to that every episode.
Thanks so much to everybody who's contributed to that already. You are part of the solution. And a special big thank you to Anna Constance Schroeder for her donation.
We've also been in another podcast.
Yeah, kind of a bit of incestuous cross-promotion here, but we were interviewed by Christian Peterson on the New Books in Religion podcast about our recent edited volume, After World Religions. as well as talking a bit about the RSP.
Yeah, I was really pleased with the way it turned out. Obviously, when you're on the other side of the mic, you never really know how much you're babbling and how much sense you're making, but it contributes well to, so we've got that initial podcast with Jim Cox on the World Religions Paradigm. We've then got that compilation podcast that kicked the whole thing off, which we called After World Religions, ? And then this podcast with New Books in Religion really sort of forms a nice triumvirate with those two podcasts. I'm really pleased. We might actually go back and put a link into those podcast pages on our site to the New Books in Religion.
I think it forms a triptych rather than a triumvirate. Yeah, but yeah, and that was a lot of fun. I was pleased as well with the way it came out. But then you think we've had a fair bit of practice now. 260 or 70 episodes in now, so. You'd hope that we had some level of professionalization.
Absolutely. So you can come back next week, folks, to hear a new interviewer, Tom White, speaking with Wesley Wildman. And they've been talking about modeling religion and the integration of the sciences and the humanities in the biocultural study of religion. So I'm really intrigued to hear that interview. Really glad to have Tom out in New Zealand doing interviews for us there.
Excellent. Until next week, however, thanks for listening. The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Jana Shirley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget, you can support the project using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals.